Please be sure to subscribe to the channel to update the fastest and most accurate news. Hello everyone, welcome back to my Royal Life News channel. The story for today is it emerged yesterday that Prince Charles and his wife Camilla are set to visit Canada next month as part of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations. During their visit, the royal couple will acknowledge the treatment of Indigenous people, the Deputy Private Secretary said yesterday. More than 150,000 Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their families and placed in residential schools across Canada from 1863 until the 1970s. The system was created by Christian churches and the Canadian government in the 19th century in an attempt to assimilate and convert Indigenous youngsters into Canadian society. The children were forced to cut their long hair, banned from speaking their own languages, and many were both physically and sexually abused. An estimated 6,000 children are believed to have died at the schools. The prince's visit, his 19th to the country, will be the first since more than 1,000 unmarked graves were found in unmarked graves at former church-run schools last year. During protests on Canada's National Day last July, statues of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth II were toppled and desecrated across the country amid fury at the discoveries. In 1867, the Canadian Confederation of what had been separate British colonies in North America were established, creating a self-governing state within the British Empire. Queen Victoria, who ruled from 1837 until her death in 1901, was on the throne when the residential school system was in full swing. Victoria never visited Canada and, given her status as a constitutional monarch, had very limited influence over the government in the UK and even less ability to question policies made in Canada. The system was largely a result of Canada's Indian Act, which was passed in 1876 under Canada's Liberal Prime Minister Alexander Mackenzie. However, prior to Confederation, it was the passing of the Gradual Civilization Act, which required Indigenous people to speak either English or French, which the system ultimately rested on. Its aim was for Indigenous people to no longer be deemed an Indian and instead become regular British subjects. In 1920, attendance at the residential schools became compulsory for Indigenous children between the ages of 7 and 15. When Dominion status was formally granted to Canada in 1926, it was recognized as an autonomous community within the British Empire. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster confirmed its full legislative independence, although full sovereignty was not formally passed until 1982. It meant that, while the Indigenous school system continued, the British government and monarch were not involved in its maintenance. It wasn't until 1982 that the Canadian Constitution was amended to recognise the rights of Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. Queen Elizabeth II, who remains Canada's monarch, has a purely constitutional role both in the UK and in former British colonies where she remains head of state. It means that, while statues of her have been toppled, she had no ability to influence Canada's residential school system. At the end of June last year, an Indigenous group said they had found 182 children bodies using ground-penetrating radar at the former street. Eugene's Mission School in Cranbrook, British Columbia, just a few days earlier, officials in Canada's Saskatchewan province said they had found 751 unmarked graves on the site of a former residential school in the region. The Maryville Indian Residential School, in the southeastern Saskatchewan, was operated by the Roman Catholic Church from 1899 to the 1980s. And in May last year, the remains of 215 children were found at another residential school near Kamloops, British Columbia. The Kamloops Residential School was established in 1893 and closed in 1978. Other potential discoveries have been made this year. Last week, officials said they had found 14 potential unmarked burial sites at the former Gordon's Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan. Whilst ground-penetrating radar data did not confirm that the sites are graves of children, George Gordon First Nation member Sarah Longman said there was a high probability. In March, a further 169 potential unmarked graves were found at the Gruard Indian Residential School, which was also known as St. Bernard Mission School, in northern Alberta. That discovery came the month after 54 unmarked graves were found in the grounds of the former Fort Pelly and St. Philip's residential schools near Kamsack, Saskatchewan, in the U.S., a similar system of boarding schools, for Native Americans, existed with the aim of civilizing children into Western culture. The U.S. system was in place from the mid-19th century until the mid-20th century. Canada's then Prime Minister Stephen Harper formally apologized to the First Nation peoples in 2008 for the residential school system. The following year Canada formed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which hosted events all across the country for people to share their stories of life inside the residential schools. After 7 years of hearings, and testimony from thousands of witnesses, the Commission concluded in 2015. It called for a new era of forgiveness and understanding, while recognizing the horrors the system had forced on the Indigenous population. These measures were part of a coherent policy to eliminate Aboriginal people as distinct peoples and to assimilate them into the Canadian mainstream against their will, its final report said. The Canadian government pursued this policy of cultural genocide because it wished to divest itself of its legal and financial obligations to Aboriginal people and gain control over their land and resources. In last year's protests, statues of Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth II and the explorer Captain Cook were toppled and desecrated. The bronze sculptures of Britain's current monarch and her great-great-grandmother in Winnipeg were hauled down, daubed with red paint and even appeared to have been strangled with Mohawk flags. Protesters in orange led by members of the left-wing anti-colonial Idle No More group campaigning for Canada Day to be cancelled, tied ropes to the necks of the statues and ripped them to the ground to chants of no to genocide and bring her down. The statue of Captain Cook, who was the first Briton to land in British Columbia, was also pulled down in the western city of Victoria. It was then hurled into the harbour in scenes reminiscent of the destruction of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol last year. The Royal Navy captain famously made 3 voyages in the Pacific Ocean and to Australia, but did also spend time in Canada. He was involved in the blockade of Louisbourg against French forces in 1758 and in 1761 made charts of the town and harbour at Halifax. He also took part in the assault on the then French-held Quebec. Boris Johnson condemned the damage to the statue of the Queen, and added his condolences following the discoveries of the human remains. Announcing Prince Charles' visit to Canada next month with his wife the Duchess of Cornwall, Clarence House said yesterday that the heir to the throne has long believed that we need to learn from Indigenous peoples around the world how better we should live in and care for nature and the planet. They added that this tour will highlight an emphasis on learning from Indigenous peoples in Canada and focus on a more sustainable way of living with global warming. Chris Fitzgerald, Deputy Private Secretary to Prince Charles for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs, said the royal couple would take part in a solemn moment of reflection and prayer at the Heart Garden, the memorial to Indigenous children who died in the residential school system that stands in the grounds of Government House in Ottawa. He added, Heart Gardens are in memory of all Indigenous children who were lost to the residential school system, in recognition of those who survived, and the families of both. Mr. Fitzgerald also said that Charles and Camilla would take the opportunity to continue to engage with Indigenous communities throughout their tour. Over 5 decades, His Royal Highness continues to learn from Indigenous peoples in Canada and around the world, he added. He recognizes their deep ties to the land and water and the critical traditional knowledge they hold to restore harmony between people and nature. His comments came after the Earl and Countess of Wessex's royal tour to the Caribbean was hit by protests. Prince Edward and his wife Sophie were told yesterday that Antigua and Barbuda intended to become a republic, something that echoed the Cambridge's visit to Jamaica and other Caribbean nations last month, when similar comments were made. Prince William and Kate were hit by accusations that their tour was promoting colonialism and were told by Jamaican Prime Minister Andrew Holness that his nation is moving on and its destiny is as an independent, developed, prosperous country. Members of the royal family have been undertaking tours across the 14 other realms which have the Queen as their head of state to mark the 96-year-old's Platinum Jubilee, while she remains in England at Windsor Castle. Charles and Camilla last toured Canada in 2017, making stops in Ontario, Nunavut, and Canada's capital region. During that visit, they marked the 150th anniversary of Confederation with Canadians. That is all for today news. Please make sure to leave your comment and subscribe the channel below for more news update.